2:15 in the morning. The Persian Gulf, 40 miles west of the Strait of Hormuz. The USS Gerald R. Ford was maintaining a steady 20 knots on a southeasterly course when the quiet of the night was shattered by a flash on the northern horizon. High above the Iranian coastline, a thermal bloom appeared on satellite telemetry that was not a scheduled test and certainly not a civilian launch. The strike group had exactly 340 seconds to determine if this was a localized error or the opening salvo of a full-scale regional war. The air over the water was heavy with humidity and the iron scent of the sea, perfectly still until the carrier's internal speakers erupted with the call to general quarters. The deck beneath the feet of the sailors began to vibrate as the 4 propeller shafts increased their revolutions per minute, pushing the 100,000-ton vessel into a defensive turn. The threat was identified almost instantly by the space-based infrared system orbiting thousands of miles above the Earth. The data was downlinked in milliseconds to the Combat Direction Center of the USS Gerald R. Ford and the surrounding escorts of Carrier Strike Group 11. The signature was unmistakable: the high-velocity, short-range ballistic profile of the Fateh 313. A battery of mobile launchers, hidden within the rugged coastal ravines near Bandar Abbas, had just loosed a coordinated volley of 6 missiles. These were not old, unguided rockets, but modern solid-fuel projectiles equipped with terminal guidance systems and designed to strike moving targets at sea. In the dimly lit confines of the Combat Direction Center, the blue glow of the ANSPY-6 radar displays showed the tracks climbing rapidly into the upper atmosphere. The commanding officer of the Gerald R. Ford stood behind the tactical action officer, watching the computer-generated arcs extend toward the center of the screen. Every sailor in the room was draped in flash gear, their faces pale against the dark hoods, their hands moving with disciplined precision over glass consoles. The strike group was currently in a high-threat environment, but the transition from a state of watchful waiting to active combat happened in the space of a single heartbeat. The order was given to activate the Aegis Weapon System across the entire screen of escorts. 2 miles to the starboard of the carrier, the destroyer DDG-51, the USS Arleigh Burke, turned its phased array radars to high power. The electromagnetic energy, invisible but powerful enough to disrupt nearby electronics, the ship was a predator now, its computer brains calculating intercept solutions for objects moving at 5 times the speed of sound. The Fateh 313 missiles reached their apogee, the point where they ceased their climb and began their terrifying descent toward the strike group. The air in the Combat Direction Center was thick with the smell of stale coffee and the hum of high-powered cooling fans struggling against the heat generated by the radar processors. The tactical action officer confirmed the tracks were hostile and engaged. The defense of the carrier fell to the outer layer of the screen, specifically the cruiser CG-73 and the accompanying destroyers equipped with the Mark 41 vertical launch system. Each of these ships carried a magazine of interceptors designed for exactly this moment. There was no shouting, only the rhythmic exchange of technical data and the steady voice of the radar operators calling out the decreasing range of the incoming threats. On the deck of the USS Mason, a destroyer positioned 3 miles ahead of the carrier, the first response was launched. The steel hatches of the Mark 41 system blew open with a series of sharp, metallic cracks. A Standard Missile-3 surged into the night sky, a pillar of white-hot fire that illuminated the entire hull of the ship for a fraction of a second. The roar of the rocket motor was a physical weight, a sound that could be felt in the marrow of the bones of everyone topside. The interceptor climbed at a steep angle, chasing a target it could not yet see, guided by the mid-course updates provided by the Aegis radar. The salt spray from the Gulf, whipped up by the ship's sudden acceleration, turned to steam as it hit the hot launcher deck. The Iranian battery was not finished. Even as the first interceptors were in the air, sensors detected a second wave of 4 additional launches from a different coordinate, 10 miles inland from the first site. The total number of incoming warheads was now 10. The tactical situation was rapidly saturating the available engagement windows. The strike group was no longer just defending itself. It was participating in a high-speed chess match where the pieces moved at thousands of miles per hour. The unanswered question remained: was this a desperate singular strike, Or would the horizon soon be filled with hundreds more? The silence of the Gulf was gone, replaced by the screaming of jet engines and the thunder of outgoing interceptors, leaving the water behind them churned into a white, chaotic wake. 2 minutes and 12 seconds after the initial thermal detection, the central airspace of the Persian Gulf became a mathematical grid of life and death. While the physical world was dark and humid, the digital world within the Combat Direction Center of the USS Gerald R. Ford was illuminated by the sterile, high-resolution clarity of the Aegis Weapon System. The strike group was no longer a collection of individual ships, but a single, integrated sensor net known as the Cooperative Engagement Capability. Through this link, the radar data from the cruiser CG-73 and the destroyer DDG-51 was fused into a common tactical picture, allowing every commanding officer in the fleet to see the same 10 hostile tracks with terrifying precision. The incoming Fateh 313 missiles were now screaming through the thin air of the upper atmosphere. Having reached an altitude of over 150,000 feet, they were traveling at more than 4,000 miles per hour, their nose cones glowing a dull, angry red from the friction of the edges of the atmosphere. On the radar screens, these were not just dots. They were predictive vectors, calculated by high-speed processors to determine exactly where they would be in 5, 10, and 30 seconds. The air inside the carrier's command deck was a chilling 68 degrees, a stark contrast to the sweltering 90-degree heat of the Gulf night outside. The only sounds were the low, rhythmic mutterings of the tactical operators and the faint, high-pitched whine of the liquid-cooled electronics racks. The Admiral commanding Carrier Strike Group 11 stood at the central plot, his eyes fixed on the primary display. The first wave of 6 missiles split into 2 groups of 3. The computer projected that 3 were targeted at the Gerald R. Ford itself, while the others were aimed at the supply ships, trailing the formation. This was a sophisticated targeting logic, designed to force the escorts to choose between protecting the high-value carrier or the vulnerable logistics vessels that kept the fleet fueled. The decision was made in less than 4 seconds. The cruiser, CG-73, acting as the primary air defense commander, assigned the first 4 tracks to the USS Mason and the remaining 6 to the USS Arleigh Burke. Across the strike group, the layered defense strategy began to unfold. The outer layer, the Ballistic Missile Defense Zone, was the responsibility of the Standard Missile 3 interceptors. These weapons were designed to strike a target while it was still outside the atmosphere, using a kinetic kill vehicle that functioned like a bullet hitting a bullet. On the deck of the cruiser, the Mark 41 vertical launch system tubes were purged with nitrogen. 2 more missiles erupted from their cells, the blast doors slamming back as the interceptors clawed for the sky. The smell of burnt rocket propellant, sharp and chemical, drifted across the flight deck of the nearby carrier, where the ground crews were already fueling FA-18 Super Hornets for a retaliatory strike. The technical complexity of the engagement was staggering. The ANSPY-6 radar systems on the destroyers were operating in a specialized ballistic missile defense mode, pulsing massive amounts of energy into the sky to maintain a lock-on through the plasma sheath forming around the descending Iranian warheads. Every ship in the formation was vibrating, not just from the speed of their engines, but from the massive power draw required to run the combat systems at maximum capacity. The sailors in the engine rooms, deep below the waterline, felt the deck shuddering as the massive generators cycled to meet the demand. They could see nothing of the battle above, hearing only the distant, muffled thuds of the vertical launch system firing its magazine. The first 3 Standard Missile 3 interceptors reached the edge of space. Their booster stages fell away, tumbling back toward the dark waters of the Gulf. As the kinetic warheads activated their own infrared seekers, the vacuum of space was silent, but the sensors were screaming with data. The interceptors identified the heat signatures of the Fateh missiles against the cold background of the void. Small thrusters on the kill vehicles fired in short, violent bursts, making final course corrections. Back in the Combat Direction Center, the tactical action officer gripped the edge of his console. The distance between the interceptors and the hostile warheads was closing at a combined speed of over 10,000 miles per hour. The outcome of the first engagement would be known in exactly 6 seconds. The unanswered question now shifted from the number of incoming missiles to the effectiveness of the kill vehicles. The Fateh 313 was known for its ability to perform unpredictable terminal maneuvers as it re-entered the atmosphere, a feature designed specifically to defeat the very systems the United States Navy was now employing. The humidity in the room seemed to rise as the operators held their breath, watching the two sets of icons on the screen converge into a single point. The radar return from the high-altitude zone was clear and unwavering, a testament to the billions of dollars of engineering now being tested in the crucible of real combat. The first phase of the Persian Shield was reaching its breaking point, 2:18 in the morning, 200,000 feet above the dark expanse of the Persian Gulf. The first engagement took place in the silent, airless void at the edge of space. There was no sound of an explosion, no roar of fire, only the massive, instantaneous conversion of kinetic energy into heat as the first Standard Missile-3 kinetic kill vehicle slammed into a Fateh 313 warhead. The interceptor was moving at over 9,000 miles per hour, and the target was moving at 4,000. The resulting collision was so violent that both objects were instantly vaporized into a cloud of microscopic debris. On the radar screens inside the Combat Direction Center of the USS Gerald R. Ford, a single green icon representing the interceptor and a red icon representing the threat merged, pulsed once, and then vanished. Kill confirmed on track 7042, the weapons coordinator announced, his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through his system. Within the next 4 seconds, 2 more successful intercepts were recorded. The high-altitude defense layer, managed by the cruiser CG-73, had successfully neutralized half of the first wave. However, the geometric complexity of the attack was beginning to reveal the enemy's intent. The remaining 3 missiles from the first volley and the 4 missiles from the second wave were not following simple ballistic arcs. As they hit the denser layers of the atmosphere at 30 miles up, they began to use their aerodynamic control fins to perform high-gravity maneuvers. The red dots on the Aegis displays began to jitter, as the Iranian guidance systems fought to overcome the drag of re-entry and steer themselves toward the center of the American carrier strike group. The air inside the Combat Direction Center grew even more focused, the silence broken only by the rapid-fire clicking of keyboards and the low-frequency hum of the ship's nuclear reactors providing the massive electrical surge needed for the radar systems. The second layer of the defense, the terminal phase, was now active. The Tactical Action Officer ordered the transition to the Standard Missile-6 and the Standard Missile-2 Block 3C. These missiles were designed to engage targets that had successfully bypassed the space-based defense layer and were now diving toward their targets at hypersonic speeds. On the deck of the destroyer DDG-51, the USS Arleigh Burke, the forward Mark 41 vertical launch system erupted again. 4 missiles leaped from their cells in a staggered sequence, the white smoke of their boosters momentarily obscuring the bridge windows. The smell of burnt nitrate and hot metal was sucked into the ship's ventilation system, a sharp, bitter reminder to the crew that the battle was now occurring only a few miles away. The atmosphere over the Gulf was no longer still. The sky was being torn apart by the passage of multiple interceptors, leaving glowing white trails that looked like jagged lightning against the black horizon. The heat generated by the descending Fateh missiles was so intense that they were now visible to the naked eye of the lookouts on the carrier's island, tiny, brilliant sparks of orange light falling from the stars. Below the waterline, the sonar operators on the escort ships could hear the faint, rhythmic thumping of the strike group's screws as the ships maintained a high-speed zigzag pattern, making it harder for the Iranian warheads to maintain a terminal lock. The deck of the Gerald R. Ford shuddered with every launch from its escorts, a sympathetic vibration that traveled through the water and into the steel hull of the 100,000-ton carrier. Targets re-entering the envelope, the Air Warfare Commander reported. The distance was now closing to under 20 miles. At these speeds, 20 miles was less than 15 seconds of flight time. The computers were now making decisions in microseconds. calculating which destroyer had the best line of sight to each incoming threat. Through the cooperative engagement capability, the USS Mason fired a pair of evolved Sea Sparrow missiles at a warhead that was tracking toward the carrier's port quarter. The missiles spiraled out of their canisters, their rocket motors screaming as they accelerated to 3 times the speed of sound within the first 2 miles of flight. The humidity of the night air caused thick condensation clouds to form behind the interceptors, briefly creating ghost-like shapes in the darkness, before they were shredded by the following wind. The tension in the Combat Direction Center reached a localized peak. The Admiral watched as 7 threats remained on the board. The first wave's survivors were being engaged, but the second wave was coming in lower and faster, utilizing the radar clutter of the coastline to mask their final approach. The tactical action officer called for full auto on the close-in weapon systems of the inner screen. This was the final insurance policy, the last line of defense before steel hit steel. The unanswered question was no longer about strategy, but about the raw reliability of the hardware. The strike group was a wall of sensors and missiles, but the Iranian battery had launched a saturation attack specifically designed to find a single crack in that wall. 2:20 in the morning. The radar horizon, 30 miles northeast of the carrier. The battle entered its most dangerous phase, as the second wave of Fateh 313 missiles reached their terminal descent. The Iranian battery had timed the second volley with calculated precision, ensuring the warheads arrived just as the American escorts were processing the debris and sensor noise from the first wave of intercepts. On the tactical displays, the air was becoming a chaotic swarm of overlapping icons, incoming hostiles, outgoing interceptors, and the rapidly dissipating clouds of metal from previous kills. The strike group was now facing a saturation event, the point where the number of incoming threats threatens to exceed the number of simultaneous target tracks the weapon systems can manage. In the Combat Direction Center, the temperature seemed to rise, as the human operators worked in a state of hyper-focused flow, their eyes scanning the screens for any threat that had been missed by the automated logic. The air over the Gulf was no longer black. It was a strobe-lit theater of war, illuminated by the continuous flashes of rocket motors and the orange-white bursts of successful terminal hits. The smell of the sea had been completely replaced by the sharp, metallic tang of ozone and the heavy sulfurous drift of burnt solid fuel. On the USS Arleigh Burke, the Mark 41 vertical launch system was half empty. The steel decks around the launcher cells scorched black and still radiating heat that could be felt through the soles of a sailor's boots. The ship's commanding officer authorized the use of the evolved Sea Sparrow missiles for the closest threats, shifting the engagement from long-range interception to a desperate, point-blank knife fight in the sky. The second wave's 4 missiles were not behaving like the first. 2 of them began a violent, corkscrewing maneuver at an altitude of 40,000 feet, pulling massive gravitational forces to throw off. The interceptors led calculation algorithms. The Aegis computers, processing billions of instructions per second, adjusted the steering commands for the Standard Missile 6 interceptors in real time. Through the cooperative engagement capability, the Gerald R. Ford's own sensors took over the tracking for one of the targets, handing off the data to the USS Mason, which was in a better physical position to fire. This seamless digital handoff was the pinnacle of naval warfare technology, allowing one ship to provide the eyes while another provided the teeth. Track 4019 is maneuvering. Multiple high G turns, the sensor supervisor shouted. The warhead was now only 12 miles out, falling at 4 times the speed of sound. The USS Mason loosed a pair of rolling airframe missiles from its forward launcher. These smaller, highly agile missiles spiraled out of their canisters, their infrared seekers locking onto the intense friction heat of the Fateh's nose cone. The sky was a tangle of white smoke trails, crossing and recrossing as the interceptors chased the erratic path of the incoming weapon. On the carrier's flight deck, the yellow shirts and brown shirts of the air wing ignored the spectacle above, continuing their grim work of loading AGM-88 HARM missiles onto the wings of the FA-18 Golf Growlers. They knew their turn to strike back was coming, but first, the ships had to survive the next 60 seconds. The technical strain on the strike group's power grid reached a critical threshold. The ANSPY-6 radar arrays were drawing megawatts of power to burn through the electronic countermeasures being broadcast from the Iranian coast. Lights in the carrier's passageways flickered as the massive electrical load shifted between the ship's 4 main generators. Deep in the hull, the nuclear reactor technicians monitored the steam pressure with white-knuckled intensity, ensuring the massive turbines had enough energy to power both the combat systems and the catapults for the impending launch. The unanswered question was whether the Iranian battery had a third wave ready, or if they had spent their entire magazine in this singular, violent attempt to break the American shield. The distance closed to 5 miles, the lookouts on the bridge of the Gerald R. Ford could now hear the sound of the incoming missiles, a terrifying, high-pitched scream that cut through the roar of the ship's own engines. The tactical action officer reached for the final defensive trigger. The close-in weapon systems on the carrier and its escorts, the 20mm Gatling guns, known as R2, D2, S, for their dome-like shape, shifted into automatic search mode. Their barrels tracked the sky with robotic speed, waiting for the targets to enter the final 1,000-meter kill zone. The world had shrunk to a 5-mile circle of fire, salt, and screaming metal. 2:21 in the morning. The inner defensive perimeter, 5,000 meters from the hull of the USS Gerald R. Ford. The sky over the Persian Gulf was no longer an empty void. It was a pressurized chamber of fire and kinetic energy. Of the original 10 Fateh 313 missiles, 9 had been successfully neutralized by the outer and middle layers of the strike group's Aegis shield. But the 10th missile, Track 4019, had performed a radical terminal maneuver that confused the proximity fuse of the last Standard Missile 6 interceptor. The warhead had plummeted through the debris cloud of its counterparts. Emerging from the smoke at Mach 4, its guidance system locked firmly onto the massive radar signature of the carrier's island. In the Combat Direction Center, the steady technical chatter evaporated, replaced by the cold, rhythmic voice of the automated defense system announcing, "Vampire, Vampire. Close-in engagement initiated." The environment around the strike group was a sensory assault. The air, thick with the smell of ionized oxygen and the sulfurous stench of spent propellant, suddenly vibrated with a new, terrifying sound. On the starboard side of the Gerald R. Ford, the 2 close-in weapon systems, the 20mm Gatling guns, spun up to their maximum rate of fire. The sound was not like a machine gun. It was a continuous, mechanical roar, like the tearing of a giant sheet of industrial canvas. A stream of tungsten alloy armor-piercing rounds surged into the night at a rate of 75 rounds per second, creating a visible line of white-hot tracers that reached out to swat the incoming missile from the sky. The deck beneath the sailors' feet hummed with the vibration of the mounts, while the ocean surface was whipped into a frenzy by the pressure waves of the supersonic projectiles. The technical reality of the moment was measured in milliseconds. The Fata missile was now less than 3 kilometers away. The rolling airframe missile launcher on the carrier's aft sponson fired its final 2 rounds. The small, agile interceptors spiraled into the darkness, their heat-seeking eyes fixated on the friction-white nose of the warhead. One interceptor passed within meters of the target, its blast fragmentation warhead detonating and peppering the Iranian missile with shrapnel, but the Fateh's heavy airframe held together. It was a leaker the nightmare scenario for every air defense officer in the United States Navy. The missile was too close for further missile intercepts. It was now down to the guns and the raw luck of the geometry. Inside the hull, the damage control teams were already braced. Men and women in heavy fire retardant suits stood in the darkened passageways, their backs against the bulkheads, knees slightly bent, and jaws clenched to prevent broken teeth from the impending shock. The humid air in the lower decks was silent, save for the distant, muffled thudding of the Gatling guns. The unanswered question was no longer if the defense would hold, but where the impact would occur. The tactical action officer on the bridge watched the optical feed as the Iranian warhead grew from a tiny spark into a distinct, terrifying shape, its control fins glowing white as it adjusted its final dive angle. The secondary escorts, the USS Mason, and the USS Arleigh Burke were now firing their own 20mm systems in a cross-layer support pattern, filling the airspace around the carrier with a wall of lead and tungsten. The water between the ships was being churned by falling brass casings and the impact of missed rounds hitting the waves. The air smelled of hot oil and scorched paint. The carrier's electronic warfare suites were screaming at maximum power, trying to blind the missile seeker in these final moments, but the FATA 313 was now using a passive home-on-jam logic. It was no longer looking for a radar return. It was simply flying down the throat of the carrier's own defensive emissions. The distance was now measured in hundreds of meters. The sound of the missile's passage, a whip-like crack as it broke the sound barrier just above the waves, was audible even over the roar of the carrier's engines. The Gatling guns reached their final elevation, their barrels glowing a dull cherry red in the darkness. The automated system had calculated the intercept point at exactly 400 meters from the hull. The world seemed to slow down for the observers on the bridge as the stream of tracers finally intersected with the body of the missile. Sparking hits were visible along the Fate's fuselage, but the momentum of a 1,000-pound warhead moving at 3,000 feet per second was a physical force that could not be easily turned aside. 2:21 in the morning and 48 seconds, the final 100 meters. The Fateh 313 missile, though battered by a hail of 20mm tungsten rounds, maintained its structural integrity long enough to bridge the final gap between the sky and the steel. In the Combat Direction Center of the USS Gerald R. Ford, the vampire icon reached the center of the display and fused with the carrier's own position marker. A fraction of a second later, the ship's hull was not hit by the warhead itself, but by the massive atmospheric pressure wave preceding it, followed instantly by the physical impact of the remaining airframe. The missile did not strike the carrier's island. Instead, it slammed into the portside catwalks just below the flight deck level, near the number 4 aircraft elevator. The kinetic energy of a half-ton of steel moving at 3 times the speed of sound was converted instantly into a blinding white flash that bleached the darkness of the Persian Gulf for 5 miles in every direction. The environment inside the ship transformed from a state of high-tech anticipation to one of raw, industrial chaos. The air was suddenly filled with the scent of vaporized hydraulic fluid and the acrid choking smoke of burning electrical insulation. The shockwave of the impact traveled through the carrier's 100,000-ton frame like a hammer blow to a bell, vibrating through every deck and bulkhead down to the keel. In the lower engineering spaces, sailors were thrown against machinery as the ship whipped several degrees to starboard before the stabilizing fins and the sheer mass of the hull corrected the motion. The sound was a deep, guttural boom that felt more like an earthquake than an explosion, followed by the high-pitched shriek of tearing metal as the catwalks were shredded. The technical damage was immediate but localized. The Fateh's warhead, designed to penetrate hardened structures, had detonated against the heavy armor belt of the hull. While it did not breach the main internal compartments, the blast swept upward, destroying several refueling stations and a bank of secondary communications antennas. On the flight deck, a parked MH-60 Sierra helicopter was lifted and tossed 20 feet by the overpressure, its rotor blades shattering against the deck. The automated fire suppression systems triggered instantly, spraying a thick blanket of aqueous film-forming foam across the affected area, the white chemical suds looking like snow under the red emergency lights of the island. Damage Control, Central, report. Report. The commanding officer barked into the internal comms. The response was a cacophony of voices as reports flowed in from across the ship. The number 4 elevator was jammed in the up position, its tracks warped by the heat of the explosion. Secondary fires were reported in the electronics bay adjacent to the impact point, where several miles of fiber optic cabling had been fused by the thermal pulse. Despite the violence of the strike, the Gerald R. Ford's primary combat systems remained online. The AN/SPY-6 radar continued to sweep the horizon, searching for a follow-up wave that every sensor operator expected to see at any moment. The air around the impact zone was a hellscape of orange flames and thick black smoke, the heat so intense that the salt spray from the ocean was evaporating before it could touch the hull. The escorts of Carrier Strike Group 11 reacted with the clinical efficiency of a trained immune system. The USS Arleigh Burke and the USS Mason accelerated, closing the distance to the carrier to provide a physical and electronic screen with their remaining interceptors. They did not ask for instructions. They executed pre-planned maneuvers designed to shield the damaged high-value unit from further attack. On the carrier's bridge, the admiral watched the damage control monitors with a grim, fixed expression. The unanswered question was whether the Iranian battery had successfully bracketed the carrier, using this hit to calibrate their next volley, or if the American response could be launched fast enough to silence the launchers forever. The strike group was wounded, but its teeth were now bared. The flight deck, though partially obscured by foam and smoke, remained operational on the forward catapults. The deck cycle was already underway. 4 FA-18 Gulf Growlers were taxied into position, their twin engines screaming as they went to full afterburner, the blue-white flames of their exhausts cutting through the black smoke of the impact. The air smelled of jet fuel, salt, and the iron scent of fresh blood from a few sailors caught in the catwalks during the blast. The Battle of the Persian Gulf had moved past the stage of defense. The United States Navy was about to deliver its counter-argument. 2:25 in the morning. The flight deck of the USS Gerald R. Ford. The carrier was still shuddering from the impact of the 10th missile, when the order for retaliatory fire was authorized by the President of the United States. The air was a thick, choking mixture of chemical foam, jet exhaust, and the smell of scorched deck paint. Through the haze, the catapult crews worked with mechanical speed, their movements dictated by years of muscle memory. The forward catapults, powered by the electromagnetic aircraft launch system, hummed with a building charge that could be felt in the chest of every sailor on deck. 4 FA-18 Gulf Growlers, specialized for electronic attack, were the first to be hurled into the night, their twin engines carving blue-white tunnels through the black smoke, as they banked hard toward the Iranian coastline. The technical objective was the total neutralization of the Fateh 313 battery. While the Growlers moved to jam the enemy's remaining ground-based radars, the real weight of the American response was being prepared in the vertical launch tubes of the cruisers and destroyers. The Admiral had authorized a time-on-target strike, a complex coordination where dozens of missiles launched from different platforms would arrive at the same coordinate at the exact same second. The air above the strike group was about to become a corridor of supersonic steel. The unanswered question was whether the mobile launchers had already begun their retreat into the hardened tunnels of the Iranian mountains. The trigger was squeezed. The first Tomahawk cruise missile shrieked off the deck of the cruiser CG-73, a white column of fire punching backward through the smoke. The heat blast washed across the faces of the sailors standing nearest, the temperature in the launch area instantly spiking to over 1,000 degrees. The smoke rose in a dense, swirling pillar that blotted out the horizon for 3 full seconds before the next missile followed. 20 more Tomahawks erupted from the surrounding destroyers in a rapid-fire sequence, their boosters lighting up the Persian Gulf like a string of artificial suns. 60 miles away, the Iranian battery was caught in the middle of a reload. The Tomahawk warheads, guided by satellite and terrain contour matching, dived at subsonic speeds through the coastal valleys. The first 1,000-pound warhead punched straight through the roof of a mobile command vehicle, detonating the sensitive electronics inside and sending shards of jagged steel and glass flying for 50 meters. The explosion was not a single event, but a chain reaction. The heat from the first blast cooked off the solid fuel of a Fateh missile still on its launcher. The missile erupted into a white fireball that bleached the sky white, the pressure wave compressing every chest in the vicinity and throwing men off their feet. The Iranian defenders reacted in a blind panic, attempting to drive the remaining launchers into a nearby rock gallery, but the FA-18 Gulf Growlers had already designated the targets with high-powered laser designators. An AGM-88 HARM missile, sensing the frantic pulses of a nearby search radar, drove into the heart of the battery's communication array. The impact severed the link between the launchers and their command structure, crushing the delicate antenna masts and erupting instantly into a fountain of sparks and black smoke. The sound of metal tearing was audible even over the roar of the burning fuel, a high-pitched scream of structural failure. The immediate aftermath was a landscape of absolute devastation. Black smoke rose from the wreckage of the 6 mobile launchers, the fire so intense it turned the surrounding sand into glass. The burning pieces were still settling when the radio channels on the Iranian side went into a dead silence for exactly 3 seconds, then erupted in overlapping, terrified voices. The battery that had dared to strike at the heart of the United States Navy had been erased from the map. Back on the carrier, the deck crews watched the distant glow on the horizon, the silence of the ship only broken by the rhythmic thumping of the fire pumps as they continued to wash away the foam. 2:30 in the morning. The portside catwalks of the USS Gerald R. Ford. The immediate violence of the retaliatory strike had shifted the focus from the horizon back to the skin of the ship itself. While the Iranian battery burned 60 miles away, the interior of the carrier was a hive of controlled, professional urgency. Damage control shifted from the immediate response phase to long-term stabilization. The air in the affected compartments was thick with the chemical smell of aqueous film-forming foam and the cooling scent of seawater being pumped through the fire mains. Visibility was limited to a few meters by the lingering white smoke, but the damage control teams, wearing their heavy breathing apparatuses, moved through the darkness with the confidence of people who had rehearsed this exact nightmare 1,000 times. The technical assessment of the damage was conducted with surgical precision. The impact of the Fateh 313 had destroyed exactly 42 meters of the portside catwalk and shredded the primary fuel lines leading to the number 4 aircraft elevator. Engineers from the ship's repair department used handheld thermal imagers to identify hotspots behind the bulkheads, ensuring that no hidden fires were smoldering within the insulation of the electronics bays. The number 4 elevator remained jammed, but the hydraulic technicians had already begun the process of shimming the tracks, a delicate operation involving the placement of steel wedges to prevent further warping of the lift mechanism. Despite the loss of 1 elevator, the ship's primary mission, launching and recovering aircraft, remained 75% effective using the 3 remaining lifts. In the lower decks, the medical teams were processing the casualties. The toll of the engagement was light but sobering. 4 sailors had been killed instantly in the catwalk during the impact, and another 12 had been treated for smoke inhalation and flash burns. The atmosphere in the ship's primary medical ward was quiet, the sound of the ship's ventilation system providing a constant, low-frequency hum that masked the groans of the injured. The medical officers worked under the sterile glow of LED surgical lights, their hands steady, as they treated shrapnel wounds. There was no panic. The professionalism of the crew was a physical weight, a testament to the discipline that defined the United States Navy's response to crisis. Logistics and resupply were the next priorities for the strike group. The USS Gerald R. Ford had expended 38% of its evolved Sea Sparrow missile magazine and nearly half of its close-in weapon system ammunition. During the 6-minute engagement, the Admiral ordered Carrier Strike Group 11 to maintain its position while the supply ship, the USNS Supply, began a high-speed approach from the south. Underway replenishment would be required within the next 12 hours. To restore the fleet's defensive teeth, the air over the water was beginning to cool as the first hint of pre-dawn light touched the eastern horizon, but the sailors on the flight deck remained in full flash gear, their eyes scanning the sky for any signs of a second Iranian attempt. Reactor status is normal. Propulsion remains at 100%, the watch reported to the bridge. This was the most critical piece of data. As long as the 2 A-1B nuclear reactors continued to provide power, the Gerald R. Ford remained the most formidable piece of sovereign United States territory in the region. The ship's electrical grid had been stabilized, and the AN/SPY-6 radar was operating at full power again, its digital beams carving through the humidity to watch for any movement from the Iranian coastline. The unanswered question was no longer about the carrier's survival, but about the strategic signal this engagement would send to the rest of the world. The environment around the ship was slowly returning to a state of eerie calm. The salt spray from the Gulf continued to wash the hull, mixing with the white foam that still leaked from the damaged catwalks. The deck crews had cleared the debris from the forward catapults, and the next cycle of FA-18 Super Hornets was being marshaled into position. The strike group was not retreating, it was resetting. The smell of jet fuel and salt was once again the dominant scent on the flight deck, a sign that the USS Gerald R. Ford was ready to resume its role as the primary instrument of American power in the Persian Gulf. 5:30 in the morning. The Persian Gulf. The first rays of the sun began to bleed across the horizon, turning the iron-colored water of the Gulf into a sheet of hammered gold. The USS Gerald R. Ford, still trailing thin wisps of steam and chemical foam from its portside catwalks, maintained its station as the centerpiece of Carrier Strike Group 11. The engagement had lasted less than 10 minutes from first launch to the final retaliatory strike, but the strategic landscape of the region had been fundamentally altered. The air was finally clearing of the acrid smell of burnt powder and ozone, replaced by the familiar, sharp scent of morning salt spray and the dull roar of the carrier's cooling fans. On the bridge, the Admiral watched the sunrise, his face illuminated by the amber light of the tactical displays that still showed the ghost tracks of the fallen missiles. The final assessment of the engagement was a testament to the effectiveness of the Aegis Ballistic Missile Defense System. Of the 10 Fateh 313 missiles launched, 9 had been intercepted and destroyed in flight. The single leaker that had struck the ship had caused significant localized damage to the catwalks and secondary systems, but the carrier's core combat capability and nuclear propulsion remained untouched. The technical data from the engagement, the radar tracks, the interceptor performance, and the terminal maneuvers of the Iranian warheads was already being encrypted and burst transmitted to the Office of Naval Intelligence and the Pentagon. This data was worth more than its weight in gold, providing the United States Navy with a blueprint of the latest Iranian missile technology. The cost of the defense was documented with the clinical honesty of a military report. The strike group had expended 64 interceptors and over 12,000 rounds of 20mm ammunition. The 4 sailors killed in the impact would be honored with a ceremony at sunset, their remains transferred to the fleet's medical facility for the journey home. But the mission continued. Carrier Strike Group 11 had not been forced to withdraw. Instead, it had demonstrated that even a saturated ballistic missile attack could not drive a United States carrier from its station. The replenishment at sea was already underway, with the USNS supply moving in parallel to the carrier, transferring thousands of pounds of ordnance and fuel across high-tension lines as the ships surged through the swells. The geopolitical response was swift and decisive. The destruction of the Iranian missile battery had sent a clear message. The threshold for attacking a United States carrier was absolute, and the retaliation would be immediate and total. In the Combat Direction Center, the mood was one of quiet, exhausted professional pride. The sailors who had sat at the consoles, their hands steady while Mach 4 warheads bore down on them, were now being relieved by the morning watch. They walked through the passageways of the ship, their flash gear draped around their necks, looking at the scorched bulkheads and the foam-covered decks. With the eyes of people who had looked at the end of the world and refused to blink, the environment around the carrier was now one of routine vigilance. The FA-18 Super Hornets of the Combat Air Patrol continued to circle high above, their radars scanning the Iranian coastline for any signs of further mobilization. The silence of the early morning was only broken by the occasional clank of a heavy wrench or the call of a boatswain's mate over the general announcing system. The USS Gerald R. Ford was a wounded predator, but it was a predator nonetheless, its teeth reloaded and its sensors focused. The Persian Gulf remained a place of intense tension, a theater where the margin for error was measured in milliseconds and the price of failure was counted in lives. The final report was filed under a classification that few would ever read. It concluded that the Aegis shield had held, the crew had performed with exceptional discipline, and the deterrent power of the United States Navy remained the dominant force in the region. As the sun rose higher, the smoke from the burning Iranian battery on the distant coast became a faint, vertical line on the horizon, a black monument to a failed attack. The USS Gerald R. Ford turned its bow into the wind, the four massive propellers pushing the carrier forward at 30 knots, as it prepared to launch the next cycle of aircraft into the brightening sky.